Power, scandal, legacy, the truth behind every U.S. president in one video. Let's begin with George Washington.
Born on February 22, 1732, George Washington grew up on a Virginia plantation run by moderately wealthy slave-owning farmers. After his father died when George was just 11, he inherited enslaved people but missed out on the formal education his older brothers received. Instead, he worked the land with his mother and attended a small school in Fredericksburg. By 17, George landed a job as a county surveyor, thanks to family connections, giving him adventure, income, and access to unclaimed land. His marriage to Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, brought him not only love but wealth and social standing. By 1759, Washington was serving in Virginia's House of Burgesses, focused on farming innovations through the labor of the enslaved. Then came Revolution. In 1775, Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. After victory, his reputation made him the unanimous choice as America's first president in 1789. In office, he set nearly every precedent, forming the first cabinet, using the veto, asserting executive power, and keeping the nation neutral during foreign crises. When he walked away after 2 terms, it set a democratic standard that held for over a century. Washington died in 1799. In his will, he freed William Lee, his enslaved personal valet, and arranged for the rest to be freed after Martha's death. He owned enslaved people for 56 years, but became the only founding father president to free them all. A man of contradictions. Revered leader, revolutionary icon, and slave owner, Washington's legacy still shapes the office he helped create. John Adams. Born on October 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts. A farm boy with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. By 15, he was already studying at Harvard. And instead of becoming a minister like his father hoped, John chose law and the Revolution. He married Abigail Smith in 1764, his third cousin and lifelong partner in both love and politics. Together, they raised 4 kids. 2 sons died young after struggles with alcoholism, but one, John Quincy, would follow in his father's footsteps, all the way to the White House. Adams made his name defending British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. An unpopular move, but one that proved his commitment to justice over politics. In Congress, he became a firebrand for independence and was the one who pushed George Washington to lead the Continental Army. As a diplomat, he helped secure vital treaties in Europe and played a major role in ending the Revolutionary War. But back home, things were rougher. As vice president under Washington, Adams spent 8 years mostly ignored. He famously called it the most insignificant office ever invented. In 1796, Adams finally got his turn and became the second U.S. president. Unlike Washington and Jefferson, he never owned enslaved people, though evidence suggests the household may have indirectly benefited from slavery through rented labor. His presidency was rocky. His own cabinet didn't trust him, and thanks to pressure from Alexander Hamilton, they often ignored his orders entirely. Then came the Alien and Sedition Acts, controversial laws that targeted immigrants and critics, damaging his public image. But Adams did manage to avoid war with France, a diplomatic success that likely cost him re-election. After losing to Jefferson in 1800, he retired to Quincy, Massachusetts, where he lived to see his son become president, a rare feat in history. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams uttered his famous final words. Thomas Jefferson survives. What he didn't know was that Jefferson had died just hours earlier, 2 revolutionaries dying on the same day half a century after founding a nation. You really can't script that kind of ending. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote "All men are created equal," while owning over 600 enslaved people. Born in 1743 in Virginia, Jefferson inherited land, wealth, and enslaved laborers at just 14 after his father's death. He embraced the life of a Southern gentleman, but also pursued knowledge with passion. After attending the College of William and Mary, he dove into law, politics, and philosophy, quoting Locke one minute, farming tobacco the next. He married Martha Wales Skelton, his third cousin, and they had 6 children, though only 2 lived to adulthood. After Martha died, Jefferson never remarried, but his personal life remained complicated. In 1776, Jefferson became the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, cementing his place in history with lines that inspired revolutions around the world, even as his own plantation relied on forced labor. As governor of Virginia, minister to France, and later Secretary of State under Washington, Jefferson constantly found himself clashing with rival Alexander Hamilton. Think of them as the original political nemeses. Hamilton favored a strong central bank. Jefferson wanted small government and agrarian ideals. Basically, the first cabinet meeting was already a rap battle. During his presidency, Jefferson pulled off the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the U.S. for just $15 million. Not bad for a man who hated big government spending. But his trade embargo during the Napoleonic Wars, that backfired hard, tanking the economy and enraging merchants. Jefferson's personal contradictions were as vast as the territory he acquired. He publicly criticized slavery, even called for gradual emancipation, yet never freed most of the people he enslaved. His relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, led to 6 children. 4 survived and he eventually freed them, but the legacy remains deeply complicated. After leaving office in 1809, Jefferson returned to Monticello, designed the University of Virginia, and spent his days writing letters and hosting guests. On July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration was adopted, Jefferson passed away. Just hours later, John Adams followed. The 2 rivals turned founders, dying on the same historic day. If it sounds poetic, it kind of is. James Madison, quiet, bookish, and barely 5'4", may not look like the father of the Constitution, but he absolutely was. Born in 1751 on a Virginia plantation, Madison was the eldest of 12 children. Frail and frequently sick as a boy, he found refuge in books, eventually graduating from what we now call Princeton. In 1787, as America struggled under the weak Articles of Confederation, Madison locked himself in his study and drafted what would become the Virginia Plan, the blueprint for the U.S. Constitution. And when critics pushed back, he teamed up with Hamilton and John Jay to write the Federalist Papers, convincing Americans that this new system of checks and balances could actually work. Oh, and did we mention he married Dolly Madison? A social powerhouse, fashion icon, and honestly the best PR he could have asked for. She made Madison look cool before it was cool to care about government. In 1808, Madison became president and almost immediately got dragged into war. British ships were bullying American sailors, and Congress, led by the War Hawks, demanded action. Madison declared war in 1812. But here's the thing, the U.S. wasn't exactly ready for it. In 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and burned down the White House. Dolly famously stayed behind long enough to save George Washington's portrait before fleeing. Iconic. 2 years later, the war ended in a draw, but it gave the U.S. a sense of national pride and made Madison a wartime president, for better or worse. Like many of his era, Madison's legacy is complicated. He spoke of liberty and rights, yet enslaved over 100 people at Montpelier. Even in retirement, he supported the American Colonization Society, an effort to relocate freed African Americans to Africa instead of integrating them into American life. Madison died in 1836, the last of the Founding Fathers to pass, and one of the most influential. Without him, the Constitution might not exist as we know it. If you've made it this far, you clearly love history as much as Madison loved a good political theory. So do him and us a favor. Tap that subscribe button and keep exploring America's past with us. James Monroe was the last founding father to become president and kind of like the final member of the original band still on stage. Born in 1758 in Virginia, Monroe came from money, but tragedy struck early. By 17, both of his parents had died. He dropped out of college to fight in the Revolutionary War and took a bullet at the Battle of Trenton while marching with George Washington. So yeah, he was that guy. After the war, he married Elizabeth Courtright and launched a political career that just never stopped. Senator, governor, diplomat, and even law student under Thomas Jefferson. They were close, so close, in fact, that Monroe bought land right next to Jefferson's Monticello. He called it Highland. Sounds nice until you remember it was a plantation run by enslaved people, over 200 during his lifetime. Like many early presidents, his legacy is tangled in that brutal reality. In 1803, Monroe helped pull off the biggest real estate deal in U.S. history, the Louisiana Purchase. The French were desperate for cash, and Monroe and his team walked away with 828,000 square miles for just $15 million. Jefferson only asked for New Orleans. Monroe came back with half a continent. As president, he led during the era of good feelings, but also during rising tension over slavery. He signed the Missouri Compromise to cool things down, temporarily. And with the Monroe Doctrine, he told Europe to back off the Americas, laying the foundation for future U.S. foreign policy. He died on July 4, 1831, making him the third president to die on Independence Day. What are the odds? Monroe isn't the loudest name in U.S. history, but he helped shape the country from battlefield to boardroom, from revolution to expansion. The relentless life of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams wasn't just born into history, he lived it. Born in 1767 in Massachusetts, he was the son of founding father and future President John Adams. By the time he was 10, he was already crossing the Atlantic with his dad, soaking in revolutions and diplomacy instead of fairy tales. By 14, he was in Russia as a translator for a U.S. diplomat. 2 years later, he was in Paris helping his father end the Revolutionary War. He spoke French, Dutch, and German, attended school in Europe, and finished Harvard in just 2 years. Adams became a lawyer, then a diplomat under George Washington, and later under his own father's presidency. He married Louisa Catherine Johnson, had 4 children, and kept bouncing between continents and government posts. In the Senate, he shocked everyone by siding with Jefferson and supporting the Louisiana Purchase, even though he wasn't in Jefferson's party. That move got him booted from politics, but not for long. As Secretary of State under James Monroe, Adams helped define American foreign policy. He wrote most of the Monroe Doctrine, helped acquire Florida, and settled border disputes in the Oregon Country. In 1824, he won one of the most controversial presidential elections in history, beating Andrew Jackson in what Jackson called a corrupt bargain. As president, Adams pushed for public education, a national road system, and scientific research, but Congress shot most of it down. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. Though Adams opposed slavery, his household during his presidency included enslaved people, brought by relatives. He didn't buy them, but he benefited from their unpaid labor, showing the messy moral contradictions of even the most principled men. After losing re-election to Jackson, Adams didn't retire. Instead, he ran for Congress and won. There, he became one of the loudest voices against slavery. He fought the gag rule that banned debate on slavery and used his status to protect himself from Southern threats. In 1841, he defended the Amistad Africans before the Supreme Court and won their freedom. Then, in 1848, while sitting at his desk in the Capitol, Adams suffered a stroke. He died 2 days later. He literally died fighting.
The complicated legacy of Andrew Jackson. Born on March 15, 1767, near the Carolina border, Andrew Jackson entered the world just weeks after his father died. Raised by a strong-willed mother, Elizabeth, and alongside 2 older brothers, his early life in the rugged Waxhaws region was shaped by hardship and revolution. At just 13 years old, Jackson joined the fight against the British in the Revolutionary War. He was captured, slashed in the head by a British officer for refusing to shine his boots, and watched both brothers die from war-related illness and injury. That scar on his forehead? It wasn't just physical. Jackson carried a lifelong grudge against the British. After the war, Jackson studied law in North Carolina, then set out west to Tennessee. Part lawyer, part adventurer. He became a respected attorney, a landowner, and eventually a general in the Tennessee militia. Jackson had a knack for war and controversy. In the War of 1812, he rose to national fame for defeating the Creek Nation and later the British at New Orleans, a victory that turned him into a household name. But his methods were ruthless. He forced native tribes into ceding vast lands and later led an unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida, which somehow worked out for the U.S. Spain ceded the territory in 1819. Jackson ran for president in 1824 and actually won the popular vote, but lost in Congress due to what he called a corrupt bargain. He came back swinging in 1828, branding himself as the voice of the common man. The campaign was nasty. His opponents dug up duels, executions, even attacked his beloved wife Rachel, accusing her of bigamy. She died just before he took office. Jackson never forgave Washington's elite for what he believed was their role in her death. As president, Jackson was intense. He hated monopolies, especially the Second Bank of the U.S., which he torched with a veto. He loved the Union, so when South Carolina tried to defy federal tariffs, Jackson basically said, "Try me," and threatened military action. But his worst legacy? The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Jackson claimed it would prevent conflict, but in truth, it led to the Trail of Tears, displacing and killing thousands of Native Americans. Jackson was also a slave owner, unapologetically so. He brought enslaved people to the White House and expanded his plantation in Tennessee even after his presidency. He disliked both radical pro-slavery voices and abolitionists, not out of morality, but because he thought they threatened national unity. After 2 terms, Jackson returned to the Hermitage, where he spent his final years managing his estate, writing his memoirs, and staying politically involved. He died in 1845, still a hero to some, a villain to others. Andrew Jackson was a man of fierce loyalty, raw ambition, and brutal contradictions. He shaped America, but not always for the better. Martin Van Buren, the Fox of Kinderhook. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, a small Dutch town where his father ran a tavern that doubled as a political clubhouse. Growing up among the noise of debates, travelers, and whiskey-fueled gossip, young Martin soaked in politics like most kids soak in cartoons. Though just 5'6", Van Buren had sharp political instincts and a style so smooth they nicknamed him the Little Magician. He studied law, married his cousin Hannah Hose, and climbed New York's political ladder with astonishing speed, leading a Democratic faction called the Bucktails. Yes, they wore actual deer tails on their hats. Tragedy struck early when Hannah died in 1819, long before Van Buren reached the national spotlight. He never remarried. By the 1820s, he was a U.S. Senator, briefly Governor of New York, and then Secretary of State under President Andrew Jackson. His loyalty to Jackson during the Petticoat Affair, basically DC's version of Real Housewives, earned him major points. Jackson loved him. His enemies? Not so much. Vice President John C. Calhoun literally cast the tie-breaking vote to block Van Buren's ambassadorship, thinking that would end his career. Instead, it made Van Buren more popular. Classic backfire. In 1836, Van Buren rode Jackson's popularity into the presidency. He was the firstborn American president. All his predecessors were born before independence. But he inherited a mess. The Panic of 1837, one of the worst economic collapses in U.S. history. Banks failed, businesses closed, and people blamed Van Buren, especially when he was spotted sipping fine wine while they were eating hardtack. Despite championing Jacksonian policies, including Indian removal, Van Buren showed restraint on Texas annexation, fearing it would stir conflict over slavery and possibly war with Mexico. This decision would later cost him support from Southern Democrats. He ran for president again in 1848, this time as the Free Soil Party candidate, opposing slavery's expansion. It was a bold move, but it split the vote and handed victory to Zachary Taylor, a war hero. Van Buren spent his final years at Lindenwold, his estate in New York, where he reflected on a political career that was brilliant, bumpy, and surprisingly modern. He died in 1862, quietly, as the country he once led tore itself apart in civil war. William Henry Harrison, the president who didn't last. William Henry Harrison was born on February 9, 1773 at Berkeley Plantation in Virginia, right into the lap of wealth and slavery. His father signed the Declaration of Independence, so politics ran in the blood. Young William studied the classics, then dabbled in medicine, until he suddenly joined the Army at 18, within a day of meeting a recruiting officer. Yes, one day. He spent much of his early life out on the northwest frontier fighting Native American resistance to white settlement. In 1795, he married Anna Tuthill Sims, and they went on to have 10 children, making his personal legacy quite literally prolific. As an officer under Mad Anthony Wayne, Harrison helped win the Battle of Fallen Timbers, opening the Ohio Valley for white settlers. He left the Army in 1798 and quickly jumped into politics, becoming governor of the new Indiana Territory in 1801. His job? Get land, lots of it, from native tribes. And he did, mostly through lopsided treaties and small payouts. But not everyone was willing to sign away their homelands. Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet tried to unite the tribes and push back. When Tecumseh was out rallying allies, Harrison marched on their base, Prophetstown. Though both sides agreed to a ceasefire, native warriors launched a surprise attack on November 7, 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison fought them off, then burned their town to the ground. It earned him the nickname Old Tippecanoe, and also kicked off more violence. In the War of 1812, Harrison returned to military glory, defeating the British and Native coalition at the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed, shattering Native resistance in the Northwest for good. Though he owned slaves, Harrison often tried to walk a political tightrope, avoiding direct criticism or defense of slavery while quietly opposing restrictions on it in new territories. He never fully took a stand, which somehow kept him palatable to both sides. Fast forward to 1840, the Whig Party ran Harrison in what might have been the first modern political campaign. With slogans like Tippecanoe and Tyler too, they painted him as a humble war hero, even though he was born in a literal mansion. He crushed it in the Electoral College, and at 68 became the oldest president elected at the time. Then came his infamous inauguration. He delivered the longest inaugural speech in U.S. history, in the freezing cold, without a coat or hat. A few weeks later, he fell ill. And on April 4th, 1841, just 31 days into his presidency, Harrison died. John Tyler, the accidental president who sided with the South. John Tyler was born into privilege on March 29, 1790, on his family's Virginia plantation. He studied law, married Letitia Christian, and eventually built his own estate, Woodburn, where he lived with 24 enslaved people by 1820. Tyler climbed the political ladder as a Southern Democrat who didn't always toe the party line, especially when President Andrew Jackson got too power-hungry for his liking. In 1840, the Whigs needed a Southern name on the ticket, so they slapped on Tyler as William Henry Harrison's VP. The campaign slogan? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But Harrison died just 1 month in, and suddenly Tyler was president. That's when things blew up. He vetoed a key Whig bill, got kicked out of the party, lost most of his cabinet, and was left with no political allies. Critics mockingly called him his accidency. Still, he made one lasting move, annexing Texas right before leaving office, fueling tensions that would later explode into the Civil War. After his first wife died in 1842, Tyler remarried Julia Gardner and fathered 15 children between both marriages, still the most of any U.S. president. In his final years, Tyler backed the Confederacy. He died in 1862, becoming the only U.S. president laid to rest under a foreign flag, that of the Confederacy. James K. Polk, the workaholic who redrew America. James K. Polk, born in 1795 in North Carolina, grew up in Tennessee, where his father became a wealthy judge and slave owner. Despite being a sickly kid, Polk was brilliant, graduated from UNC, studied law, and married the sharp and politically savvy Sarah Childress. They never had kids but shared a lifelong political partnership. Polk rose fast, earning the nickname Young Hickory for backing his hero Andrew Jackson. He became Speaker of the House and later Governor of Tennessee, while quietly growing rich through cotton plantations worked by enslaved people, including land taken after the Indian Removal Act. In a surprise twist in 1844, Polk became the 11th president, running on a platform of manifest destiny. He wanted the U.S. to stretch coast to coast. He delivered. He settled the Oregon border with Britain and waged the Mexican-American War, gaining 500,000 square miles, what's now California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more, But he also expanded slavery, used enslaved labor in the White House, and secretly bought enslaved children for his Mississippi plantation. Polk only served one term, he promised two, and retired exhausted. Just 3 months later, he died of cholera in 1849. He was 53 and arguably one of the most efficient presidents in U.S. history, for better or worse.
Zachary Taylor, the reluctant president who died before the storm. Zachary Taylor was born in 1784 in Virginia, but grew up on a Kentucky plantation worked by enslaved laborers. With little formal education, Taylor dreamed of a military life and got it. At 22, he joined the Army and spent decades fighting Native American tribes and patrolling the frontier. He married Margaret Smith and raised a large family while managing plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi, all run by enslaved people. Taylor became a national hero during the Mexican-American War, defeating a much larger force at the Battle of Buena Vista. Riding that fame, the Whigs made him their presidential candidate in 1848, despite the fact that he'd never held office. He won, barely, thanks to a split vote caused by the new Free Soil Party, which opposed slavery's expansion. As president, Taylor was a Whig on paper, but he didn't follow the party line. He opposed the spread of slavery, yet continued enslaving people, even inside the White House. When debates erupted over whether newly gained Western land should allow slavery, Taylor backed California and New Mexico's bid for free state status. When Southern leaders threatened secession, Taylor didn't blink. He warned he'd personally lead the Army to hang anyone who tried to break the Union. But he never got the chance. After attending a July 4th event in 1850, Taylor fell ill and died 5 days later, just 16 months into his presidency. The Civil War he was ready to face, it came 11 years later. If you made it this far, you clearly love dark twists in U.S. history. So hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and let us know if you want a part 2.